Children's for inviting us to come here. An executive director and co-founder of Youth in Mind. We're a youth and young adult leadership development organization. We're California-based, but we're here in Alameda County. We work with young people doing education and advocacy skill building for those that are impacted by mental health systems. And I'll let Joy introduce herself.
My name is Lamara Coleman. Thanks. And I'm a Youth in Mind participant. I've been a member since 2008, 2009. And I'm just here to share my experiences growing up in foster care and to support the work that EBAC is trying to do.
Yeah, so we wanted to show our digital stories because sometimes it's really hard to talk about our experiences. And we wanted to focus a little more on what actually worked, like what helped us kind of move from our adverse childhood experiences. And a little bit about how we're going to kind of have some dialogue going back and forth, and we're focusing it on EBAC's theory of change with their strategic approaches of prevention, recovery, and resiliency. So a bit, as you saw from my digital story, I feel like prevention was actually a lot of missed opportunities, and so to that, I think that my recovery is actually really more so folded in my resiliency. And so prevention is something that I hold to my heart, like every day. I think, even sometimes getting out of bed and doing the work that we do, I have to think about how do I prevent like some of, not just generational foster care, but also some of the lived experiences that run in my family, in my biological family, which is bipolar, and also schizophrenia. And sorry, I'm getting a little nervous, I'm starting to trail. So when I think about prevention and also trying to cultivate and build resiliency and also be a model to other young people that I work with, think about how do we build wellness plans, like how do we even have eat right, like really even understanding what our lives are when we're growing up in systems and trying to do the good community work that we're doing. Yeah.
And so I also just want to talk about the importance of prevention. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, a long time ago, but I grew up in foster care. I was born and I was raised here in Oakland, deep East Oakland, not the cute little gentrified parts, but the parts that don't have grocery stores and the parts that folks don't like to drive through. And I grew up with a mom who had substance abuse, addiction, and my father's been incarcerated for the past 25 years serving a life sentence. And so some of my experiences being removed from home and entering the foster care system, there were also other moments of missed opportunities where folks just did not check in to see what some of the issues were that I was struggling with. And as a result of those missed opportunities, especially in schools, it's really important that we have programs that are school-based, that are checking in to find out why these students who are bright are just not showing up and not passing their classes. So because I moved around to so many different homes, I didn't have that strong academic foundation to stand on, and by the time I got to high school, I was completely checked out. And I didn't have someone like a service provider asking, or checking in with me. I mean, I know that programs exist for disabled students and there's programs with IEPs, but for foster youth, there's really nothing that exists in schools. There's no way to really identify who are the foster kids that are on our campus. So it's really important to have that type of support. And when I eventually went into transitional housing, I learned about programs such as Youth in Mind, and I've been a member since. And when I found Youth in Mind, I just started to discover ways that I could take better care of myself. I learned about creating wellness plans and things like that. So, it's just really important that we have service providers in the community that are watching for the signs of really bright kids just not doing well and just asking the right questions and finding out what's going on at home. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan and Joy. I appreciate you sharing very deeply with us.
Yes.
So now we are going to bring up our speakers from EBAC to talk about how the plans we have for the next few years are going to help us address the issues that you've heard very eloquently outlined by our speakers tonight. So without further ado, Josh Leonard, our Executive Director.
Can people hear me if I talk like this? Yeah, good? Okay, cool. So thank you to all of you so much for coming, and I know many of you are longtime supporters of VBAC in different ways, and I'm incredibly grateful and always energized being in the room with so many people who are passionate about doing right by vulnerable kids and families. So thank you. Excited to share with you about our plan. We've had speakers defining problem and need, and now we're going to talk about where we think VBAC can bring value towards solutions. First, let me just tell you briefly about our planning process. So this is a culmination of a year-long process, maybe even more than a year when we started it. And going into it, we were highly committed that at the end, we didn't just have a beautiful document that we could wave around and check off a list and then put in a drawer until 3 or 5 years later we needed to go through it again. We really felt like EBAC was at a point in time where we wanted to come together collectively and figure out who we are as an organization and what are our aspirations going forward and how do we best marshal our resources to affect that. And so a year later, I'm incredibly proud, feeling like we were successful in that endeavor. That success can be attributed to the hard work of lots of people, but I do want to recognize that we had a strategic planning work group that consisted of 6 board members and 6 staff that met very regularly for a 7 or 8 month period, I think. And lots of them are here today. Actually, if you guys would just stand up and wave really quickly, that would be very cool. Yeah, again, I feel really good that the final product here is the best of our collective thinking, and that we're all behind it and looking forward to putting it in action. So the centerpiece, I think, of our plan is a theory of change. Susan made reference to it. Jen Leland, who is the Director of Clinical Services at EBAC and is a member of the work group, is going to come and lead you through some of the important elements of that right now.
Okay, it comes down now. Hi, everyone. Hi. Honored to be here too. A little nervous. And want to thank the speakers who came before me. Thanks for bringing heart to this topic. So in general, I think we know a lot. We know we're at a time in our field in this work where we know a lot about adversity. We know a lot from the ACEs study. We know a lot about social determinants of health. We know a lot about disparities in health. We know a lot about social determinants of health. We have the information. We have the research, and a lot of this is legitimized now by science. What used to be like a mental health problem or a social service problem is now legitimized by research and science and can no longer sort of be siloed and must be taken seriously by all of us, including healthcare. So we know a lot, and I think for me the question is, how much do we care? Because we do know a lot, and I think we also know a lot about what to do. We have resiliency science out there. We have science about best practices and what creates outcomes. So the question for me boils down to, do we care enough to go out and do these things as a community? We know about the disruption to neurological development that happens as a result of ACEs, but we also know about neuroplasticity, and we know that the things we can do to contribute to healing actually happen through epigenetics too, right? We can change what we're all doing, educators in this room, healthcare professionals, mental health professionals, clergy, our spiritual homes, we're all trying to change brains so that kids can learn, so that kids can be more open, and so that kids can have a chance. I think that when EBAC sat down to think about, resiliency, prevention, and recovery, it sort of boils down for me to two things that really people who've been through trauma need to know. And that's three things, actually. That they're not crazy, that there's nothing wrong with them, they're not at fault, and that they're not alone. That all the best practices and the evidence-based practices are really restoring connection to self, connection to community, and connection to spirit. So we know that hurt people, and we heard people talk about it's no longer acceptable for us to ask questions like, why do you do the things you do, Johnny? It's more important to ask questions, what happened to you? Right? We know that scared kids do scary things. It's no longer acceptable to put the kids that are doing scary things in special programs that are pipelines to prison. And we know that the prison system looks at third grade reading levels to predict that space. So I'm not going to get too deep. There's also a lot of hope in this process. This country is really good at solving public health crisis. So Dr. Nadine Burke is a doctor in San Francisco, and I like to hear her speak about the ACEs study. And one thing she always talks about is that the life expectancy rates for those diagnosed with HIV/AIDS pre-1996 was about 15 months. And now people can expect to live decades. And even the treatment might extend your life expectancy. So this country is really good at solving public health crisis, right? When it's not a mental health problem or a social service problem or those kids, that neighborhood problem. Okay, so recovery. What do we know about recovery? We know that there's this concept of neuroplasticity, and we know that there are some components that work towards recovery and helping children heal from the adverse effects of childhood trauma. We know that the number one factor in healing is that the interventions are relational. Kids get hurt in relationships, but they also heal in relationships. So we're not going to create video games that heal kids. It has to begin with relationships, right? The caregiver gets ruptured, the caregiver must be restored. And that caregiver may not be that child's mom or dad, right? It might even be, for some kids, it's the school. For some kids, schools are places of trauma, right? How many lockdowns has our Oakland Unified School District had just last week in the elementary schools? But for some kids, schools are sanctuaries too. It's where they feel at home. We had a kid once we worked with who would go to school all day long, but not go to any classes. He talked to the receptionist, he talked to the SRO, the school resource officer, he talked to his friends, wouldn't go to any classes, but went there for sanctuary, went there for recovery, went there for connection. So I like to talk about the R's of recovery. Relational, rewarding, repetitive, patterned. We do therapeutic drumming in some of our school-based programs. We know that trauma changes, that persistent fear response that Dana talked about earlier is a patterned, habitual response that we then can counteract with more positive patterned, habitual responses that are regulating and soothing as opposed to fearful and toxic. And that we want our interventions to be relevant and rhythmic. People talked about resiliency and resiliency science. So we know that there are certain protective factors that lead to resiliency. And we're measuring those at EBAC, right? We're measuring ACEs as part of our prevention strategy. So we can tell you, I can tell you the average ACEs score. One of the highest ACEs scores we have actually is at our therapeutic nursery school. And they're not even done hitting, they're not even to 6 yet. And their rates of adverse childhood experiences are some of the highest. But we also know the factors and the components that lead to resiliency and lead to healing, and we know the protective factors, and we know the protective factors that contribute to increased social determinants of health, right? And we know it begins with access. And bringing services to kids and families where there are, and not waiting for them to come to us. We know that it's one relationship with a consistent, nurturing caregiver. And for some of us, that's not going to be the caregiver, right? It's going to be somebody out in the audience tonight. Who cares? We know that concrete support, so access to healthcare, access to food, access to church, access to sanctuary, access to transportation when needed, and access to quality schools where there's teachers. There's enough teachers, and the teacher ratios aren't astronomical. We know that these things lead to resiliency building. And resiliency science, again, is a mirror of how do we change the plasticity of the brain? How do we reduce the impact of adverse childhood experiences and the damage that's already been done developmentally? How do we disrupt intergenerational transmission of trauma and begin to do intergenerational transmission of resilience? How do we support caregiving systems so that schools aren't places of persistent fear responses ongoing, but they're sanctuaries? That more kids get more healing even in the schools. And then I'm going to end with prevention. So EBAC, we do a lot of prevention work, actually, and I would argue that anytime you're helping a child heal from the impact of adversity in childhood, you are starting to prevent the next generation from facing those same demons, right? So prevention work is, we wake up doing it. We do universal prevention, screening. So going back to just the simple act of asking questions, what happened to you, right? Letting them know that, hey, adverse childhood experiences does contribute to you feeling crazy, and you feeling crazy doesn't mean you are crazy, and normalizing the experience of children. So that universal screening and education around the impact and a language that kids and families can understand and relate to is one way to build prevention. Selective prevention strategies. EBAC targets certain groups that we know to be at higher risk, right? Or that we know from our own screening process are at higher risk. So we have targeted interventions. And preventing the increased incidence of ACEs for the next generation. So our prevention strategies, for me, stop reading this card. The most exciting thing about the prevention, recovery, resilience is that it's not something we can do alone at EBAC, right? HIV/AIDS wasn't something that sex ed could solve alone, right? It took many, many, many partners and many systems to come together and say this is our problem. And in addressing that problem, and I feel like the work that we do here with childhood adversity is no different, that in coming together and addressing that problem, it makes our communities better. So it's not about some of our population treating this other population. It's really about us coming together and caring together, which in the end creates resilience-informed communities and resiliency-informed interventions, and helps both the folks that are showing up and caring enough about these kids to step in and connect and ask what's up, and seek out interventions and break down barriers to access and look at things like food access and nutrition. It heals both the folks that are showing up to do the work and the people that are receiving that care. So that's what's really exciting for me about this work. I think it's incredibly important. I think it is the work, the president of Pediatric Care said it was the #1 public health crisis hidden in plain sight, facing our generation today. We have a mandate, I think, if we care about our kids, to do this work and to come together and to not wait for the next ACEs study to come out. We know the impact, and I started my speech sort of saying knowledge is not enough. We are being asked to care enough. I feel like I'm being asked to care enough. I have the knowledge, I have the data, I know the outcomes, I know the impact. What are my actions? So I want to thank the people that were involved in this, and I want to thank all the people that helped us out by coming up here and speaking today. And thank all of you who are going to help us in this movement. We will call upon you. Because we can't do it alone, right? I can't do this alone. We have to have your help. Thank you.
Kelly, can you actually go back to those theory of change tests? I just want to take people through that really quickly. So during the process of our strategic plan, we ended up restating our mission. And so our new mission is East Bay Agency for Children improves the well-being of children, youth, and families by reducing the impact of trauma and social inequities. So I hope everyone heard clearly tonight from the speakers why reducing the impact of trauma and social inequities is important, not only for individual children, but our community at large. And we also restated that our specific commitment in terms of population that we serve, our children and families in the East Bay, disproportionately impacted by poverty, violence, marginalization, loss of loved ones, and other forms of trauma. And let me just speak to a second why, again, I think this specialization is incredibly important. People need different things, right? And they get their needs solved through different types of interventions. What works for some people might not work as well for other people. And the example I give sometimes, I get my health care at Kaiser, and it works really great for me. I love it. I don't know if everyone has that experience, but me, it's great. But if you sort of take away my car, and I can't get to Kaiser anymore, it becomes more challenging. If my primary language is English and not spoken, is a different language and not spoken by the physician, it becomes more challenging. If I don't know how to navigate a computer, more challenging. So all of these things that are very convenient for me actually make it inaccessible to other people. And that's why EBAC exists. There are some providers out there doing really great work, but they're not specifically focused towards this target population. And we're able, because of our language capacity, because of the diversity of our staff, because we have long histories embedded in these communities, to connect with families and children who otherwise might be disconnected and leverage those relationships into helping them get all of their needs met. Okay, so there's that. And Kelly, can you go to the other slide? Yeah, so, again, I think I just articulated some of the reasons why this is important, but we achieve our mission through the offering of a place-based, comprehensive continuum of services that are culturally relevant, linguistically appropriate, and continuously trauma-informed. And again, I hope you got from just my comments before why place-based is important for the population we're serving, as well as a cultural and linguistic match, and us being trauma-informed with what we're doing. Okay, so Kelly, can you move ahead to my stuff here? So, our strategic plan is, so we gave you a summary version today, and I hope people have time to look through it. Our internal plan is, I think, 23 pages, and it's really dense. There are lots of nuts and bolts, and it's my job to take you through some of those nuts and bolts in the next 5 minutes. It feels very daunting to do it so quickly. But I'm going to try and hit what I think are the most important things that I want to share with you to understand how we are looking at solving this problem. So if maybe there are 3 summary points of what the plan is that I would love people to go away understanding. So the first one is those of you who have known EBAC for a while know that EBAC has undergone tremendous growth in recent years. We've expanded program scope, number of kids and families being served. We have lots of stuff going on through Alameda County. And so for the next 3 years, we're actually not looking to aggressively expand more. Doesn't mean that we won't do it if opportunities present themselves, but that's not an imperative. So that was one of the decisions of the plan, that we're not looking to grow, but what we're looking to do is to ensure that we're getting the best possible outcomes with the 20,000 kids and family members that we're already serving. Okay, so one of the ways that we're going to look to do that is to build a working continuum. So on paper, EBAC has this amazing array of services, and you look at it and you say, wow, we can meet families and kids wherever they're at, right? Developmentally, you name their need, we can do it. And again, Jen spoke to the importance of relationships, so this idea that relationship can be the primary interface for the family, and then you use that to access all of these different services to meet the multiplicity of needs of families. It's amazing, it's incredible. Problem is, it doesn't always work that way. And it doesn't work that way for lots of different reasons. And they're complicated and they're hard to solve. Some of them are proximity, right? We have this really amazing 0 to 5 program in Oakland. We work with a family in Fremont. Doesn't help, right? So we have a continuum, but it's spread all over the place. And then there's funding, right? Which is, we've been very successful in cobbling together all these different funding streams, but some of them are pretty specific about what you can do, and it reinforces a siloed way of looking at things that's not consistent with what the actual needs of actual people are. And then part of it is just the way EBAC has come together. It's come together through mergers, and programs have been separate sometimes, and it's been challenging to overcome it. And so this is how it is. But we're committed now in the next 3 years to really working to make that continuum work. And so part of that, the first year, in fact, is us doing some more work and actually defining what we think a comprehensive continuum for kids and families look like, right? That's the first step. What do they actually need? Second step is how do we set it up, so that's in the later part of the plan. But that's another critical element, is building a working continuum. And then the third one is infrastructure. So, you know, I know infrastructure is not always sexy and exciting to talk about, but it's critical. And EBAC, like many nonprofits, is under-resourced its infrastructure, right? And particularly, I mentioned there have been some significant program growth in recent years, and infrastructure hasn't always kept up with it. But we really believe that in order to provide the top quality services that we need to, that we're committed to, that we need to up our game in that regard. And we need to do that to ensure that our people in the field actually have all of the supports to enable them to be successful. But we also need to do it so leadership of the agency, the board, senior management team, have access to tools to help them understand what is working and what isn't working, and that we have processes in place when things are working, we do more of that. Right? That we double down on that. And where things aren't working, we adjust and we try and make it work better. So those are the 3 big things that we're going to be working on the next 3 years. Focusing on outcomes for the communities that we already serve, working on building a continuum, and bolstering our infrastructure. So let me take you maybe a little deeper, although we don't have a lot of time. So what do we have here? Okay, so 4 different areas that we're focusing on our plan, our services. Again, I explained to you the importance of a place-based strategy, right, where people have an array of services easily accessible to them, and so working to build out that continuum, working to articulate what that looks like. One of the important things, and I think Jen referenced this, and it certainly I think was clear by the speakers we had before, we don't think EBAC should, could, needs to do it all, right? So we know what our strengths are, and we want to bring that value, but areas where we're either not doing the work or others are doing it better, we don't have to do the entirety of the continuum. We just have to identify partners and have intentional relationships in which we're working closely together. EBAC actually has lots of great relationships with community partners doing good work, but we're going to flesh that out a little more. Okay. Again, Jen touched on trauma-informed practice. This is critical to the work we're doing, and so we have to do some work to improve both our fidelity and our expertise to that. We have lots of amazing practice going on in our different programs. but it's not really centralized. It's not really core to the fabric of the organization when someone comes to work at EBAC, that they get the same standardized training, that it's a philosophical approach of EBAC and this is how we do it. And so we're going to do work to really make that part of everything we do. And not to get too far afield, but with trauma-informed practice, it's important not only for the actual direct service workers, but everyone in the organization to be trained and acting in fidelity to those principles. You know, from the people who are manning the front desk, who interface with people, critical. So we got to work on that. And the other is improving the collection and use of data. So, we collect lots and lots and lots of data. Too much data. We can't always make sense of it. And so we're working right now, and we certainly have articulated a path within the plan of much work to be done about being really clear of our different service activities. What does success look like, right? At the end, we're doing this, and how do we know if it's working or not? And so having articulated that, then we're going to set up processes to evaluate whether or not we're successful, and again, have a continuous learning process by which we use that data to inform our decisions. So lots of work to be done there, but important. Okay, so next one, strengthen our capacity. I spoke to that in terms of infrastructure. What I was just speaking of in terms of use of data, one of the shifts that we're in the process of making is away from a quality assurance framework to a continuous quality improvement framework. And so by that I mean whereby before we had a department and it was really about compliance, right? Are we following all of the rules of our contracts? Are we doing everything that we need to do? And we're shifting that. So compliance is important. We certainly are going to keep being compliant with expectations, but we want to take it up a step. And again, as I described before, we want to be able to track what does success look like and continuously have feedback loops in which we're responsive to that. So we're investing in creating that department. And then it comes to our next, which is invest in technology. So certainly for that department, that's really important investment. Once we've defined our outcomes and people start collecting them, we have to have a central place, repository, and the ability to sort of make sense and analyze and utilize it. And so I'm very happy to share that last month we signed to purchase a new electronic health record, which we are looking to go live in September, August, something like that, something soon, which we are very excited is going to give us a lot more important information as well as ease of use for our staff. Other investments in technology, as I mentioned before, critical that our folks in the field have what they need, and technology, I'm sure everyone's experienced. Bad technology is not a help, right? So it's making sure that people have the tools that they need to enable them to be successful. And as an organization, we have the tools that actually allow us to realize our goals as opposed to being problems that we're looking to solve. Okay, staff. This is the core of what we do. It's 90% of our budget, I think. But it's the work, right? Again, as I referenced before, Jen talked about relationship being the core to EBAC success. Our ability to actually make meaningful difference, to make transformational difference in the problems that we define are completely dependent on us being able to attract, train, and retain the best quality people. And so, EBAC pays market. We want to do better by that, and so we're committed to incrementally doing better. We want to be the top payer. And we want to be able to really invest in people's development, right? We get lots of incredibly smart, idealistic people out of school. We want to train them to be great, and again, give them the ability to make the choice to work with us long term. So there's that. And then there's improving systems and processes. Lots of that's really technical stuff, but there are lots of areas that we've identified that we can improve efficiencies. We recently created a new Chief Operating Officer position. Tammy Jones is back there. Previously had been our HR director. She moved into this new position, and one of her charges is to try and figure out how do we become more effective and efficient, particularly in our administrative processes. Okay, so that's strengthening our capacity. Next one. So how do we pay for all of this? Through our process, we came to the conclusion that our current revenue mix actually works for the organization. And that was an open question going in, does this work? About 90% of our money comes from government sources, and about the other 10% is individual, corporate, and foundations. And of that 90%, a good amount of it is entitlement dollars. So we feel comfortable that that money is going to be there and that we will be able to access it if we are able to continuously demonstrate that our services are being effective. So we feel comfortable with that. It's a mix that's allowed us to do a lot of program growth, and it's allowing us to serve 20,000 kids and families a year. It's not broken, we don't need to fix it. That said, I just articulated some places where we feel like we really need to up our game. And one of them is in infrastructure. Another is we're pretty clear that as we better articulate our continuum of care, like I mentioned before, one of the impediments to actualizing that is funding, and so we're going to need some money that can be flexible to fill in the gaps where government doesn't allow that flexibility. So we're going to need to raise more money. So that's an important part of our plan is upping our fund development game, particularly corporations, foundations, and individual donors. Okay, last one, governance. So there are a number of EBAC board members here tonight. I'm a little more year into my job, and I can say EBAC is a really great board, and I feel incredibly grateful to come into an organization with such a group of people who are so committed and are also great thought partners. And EBAC's board has done a lot of work over the past few years in terms of trying to figure out how to evolve itself to meet the changing needs of the organization. And so that work is going to continue, and we've articulated some different steps towards that, towards the board figuring out, particularly through the lens of the newly created strategic objectives, what's the composition of the board need to be to best support all of these objectives? What's the structure? What are the different processes? So we're going to continue doing that work. Okay. 5 minutes I got through. So let me close by saying, Bert, what was the new branding of Oakland? I really love that. Yeah, I love that. I love it.
Good.
And again, I think what we've defined here tonight are some pretty significant challenges, and we don't begin to believe that EBAC alone can change that. But we have some significant assets that we're bringing to the table, and as Jen described, we're also bringing a lot of commitment and heart towards it. But like I mentioned before, we're already serving 20,000 kids and family members. That's huge, right? We're already embedded in schools and communities where those families and kids are. That's huge. We have tremendous cultural diversity and language capacity amongst our staff, and we have a diverse and complementary set of service activities. So we're starting from an incredible point here. And going back to Dr. Long's taking us through ACEs. And ACEs study was pretty profound within the strategic planning work group in terms of orienting people to what needed to be done and how we could do it. And the thing that I keep coming back to in all of that when you hear the horrific outcomes is that for individuals, those aren't determinants, right? They're risk factors. And so by giving targeted good services, we have the ability to move the needle. And, Jen described, who knows how far things will be 10 years from now, but we certainly are excited about doing our part and working with others in the community to share the commitment towards making a difference. Okay, so I'm going to end here. Let me just say, we didn't put any time for questions in our agenda, but if people had questions, I'll be hanging out afterwards and you can engage me. Or on the back of the brochure, right? Back of the brochure is my name and email address. Anyone wants to set up a time to talk more, let me know or let Julie know, or I'll bring Jen into the conversation and some of our other folks. So ongoing conversation that we're excited to have. So let me now introduce Carl Goldberg, who's EBAC's board president, also a member of the strategic planning work group. And Carl is going to close out the program tonight.
I want to, first of all, thank all the speakers tonight for presenting some really amazing and moving stories to us. And it was very, very heartfelt and incredibly moving. And I want to thank it is a privilege and an honor to have been associated with this organization for the past 7+ years. And the work that we've done, really looking at ourselves and seeing where we're going to be going, at least in the next 3, has been incredibly gratifying and very energizing and exciting. You heard Jen and Josh both talk about the theory of change, and the work that we're doing, the outcomes and continuum and the infrastructure, and our resilience and recovery and prevention and the 20,000 kids that we're doing. To me, it really boils down to the one thing that Jen mentioned, it was the relationships. That's really what we're doing. We're getting out there and building relationships and changing lives. And that's incredibly important work. And I am honored, like I said, to be able to help support that. And I guess in closing, I just ask you to thoughtfully consider what your relationship to the work that EBAC is doing in our community, and ask that you thoughtfully consider how you can join us in a meaningful way to help the families and children in our community and improve the lives of all the kids and all the families that we touch. And I thank you.